My son-in-law had no idea that I owned the company he ran as chief executive officer. To him, I was nothing but a quiet old man in a faded tweed jacket, a shadow at the edge of family photographs, someone to be tolerated the way one tolerates bad weather. One evening, he invited me to a private dinner with his wealthy parents. I accepted, because I wanted to see with my own eyes exactly how such people treat a man they believe has nothing. They revealed themselves within 20 minutes. They slid a thick white envelope across a mahogany table and offered to purchase my absence from my own daughter's life, as though a father could be bought and removed like a piece of unfashionable furniture. 5 minutes later, the foundation beneath their entire world began to crack. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and if you believe that arrogance always arrives, sooner or later, at a bill it cannot pay. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, because this story is going to take you all the way down to the very last dollar of that bill. The wind coming off the lake that January night had teeth. It came down the corridor of North Michigan Avenue like something released from a cage, and it went straight through the thin wool of my old tweed jacket, as though the fabric were a rumor rather than a garment. I stood on the pavement outside the most exclusive steakhouse in Chicago and watched valets in crisp uniforms hurry across the wet concrete to open the doors of low European sports cars, cars that cost more than the house I had raised my daughter in. I looked down at my boots, scuffed brown leather, the toes worn pale, the heels rounded off by decades of standing on loading docks and gravel lots. They were clean. I had polished them that afternoon at my kitchen table, with a rag and a tin of wax older than my son-in-law's career. But no amount of polish could disguise 15 years of honest use, and I did not want it to. I could have bought that restaurant with a single telephone call. I could have bought the building it occupied and the 2 buildings on either side of it. Instead, I had chosen the boots. I had chosen the frayed jacket with the shine at the elbows. I had chosen to drive my battered pickup truck and park it 3 blocks away, where no valet would have to touch it and no one would have to think about it. I am 69 years old. Somewhere in the middle of a long life, I learned a thing that most people never learn at all. Wealth kept quiet is a shield. Wealth displayed is nothing but a very expensive target painted on your own back. My name is Franklin Doyle. Most people who have ever mattered to me have called me Frank. My life has been built on 2 things and 2 things only: the freight and logistics company I dragged out of nothing with my bare hands, and my daughter Emily. Emily was the reason I was standing in the freezing dark that night, instead of at home with a book and the radio on low. She had married Derek Lawson 3 years earlier, in a small ceremony in a rented garden, and I had smiled through every minute of it because that is what a father does. But I had seen through Derek from the first evening she brought him to my house. I saw the way his eyes moved when he entered a room, cataloging, appraising, assigning value. I watched him measure a man by the watch on his wrist and the cut of his collar, the way a pawnbroker measures a wedding ring. He spoke to me with the thin, exhausted courtesy that people reserve for an obligation they cannot legally escape. He believed I was a retired laborer scraping by on a modest pension. He believed my small 2-bedroom house on a quiet suburban street was the outer limit of everything I had ever managed to achieve in 69 years of living. I never corrected him. I never corrected any of them, because I had made a decision long before Derek Lawson ever existed in our lives. I wanted my daughter to be loved for the person she was, for her stubbornness and her kindness, and the way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. I did not want her loved for the trust fund, sitting silent and enormous in her name, drawing interest in the dark like something asleep. Money attracts a particular species of man. I had spent 30 years learning to recognize that species across a boardroom table, and I did not intend to invite one into my daughter's bed by advertising what she stood to inherit. So I said nothing. For 3 years I said nothing, and I let a young man believe I was a nobody, and I told myself that silence was wisdom. I want to be honest with you here, because this is the part of the story I have thought about most in the time since. My silence was not entirely wisdom. Some of it was cowardice dressed up as strategy. There were things I saw in Derek Lawson that I should have said out loud to my daughter, plainly, early, while she could still hear them. I told myself she would find them out for herself. I told myself a father who interferes loses a daughter. I was wrong about that, and the cost of being wrong was paid by her, not by me. I will carry that for whatever years I have left. When Derek informed me that his parents, Gerald and Patricia, were flying into town to celebrate his recent promotion to Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Freight Holdings, he invited me to dinner. The invitation arrived over the telephone with a heavy sigh in front of it, the way a man announces a chore. He said his mother had insisted. He said it would look strange if the father of the bride were absent. He said it in the tone of someone reading a maintenance schedule aloud. I accepted immediately, and my reasons were not sentimental. I needed to know exactly what kind of family my daughter had married into. I pushed open the heavy brass doors, and the warmth of the lobby broke over me like a wave, carrying with it the smell of roasted garlic, seared beef, and perfume so expensive it seemed to have opinions. A hostess with a rigid, well-trained smile looked me over from boots to collar. I watched her eyes stop for exactly half a second on the worn elbows of my jacket, and I watched her decide something about me in that half second, and I did not blame her for it. She was doing what she had been trained to do. The world sorts men by their sleeves. I gave her Derek's name. Her smile tightened by a fraction of an inch, and she led me through the crowded main dining room toward the private suites at the back. Walking a little faster than necessary, the way you might guide a stray dog toward an exit. The heavy oak door of the private room stood slightly ajar. The conflict began before a single word was spoken. Gerald and Patricia Lawson sat at the center of a long table dressed in white linen, and they were precisely what I had expected, which is to say they were a type rather than two people. Gerald wore a charcoal suit cut close to a body that had never lifted anything heavier than a wine list, and on his wrist sat a gold watch so large it functioned less as a timepiece than as a warning. Patricia wore silk, the color of old ivory, and a rope of pearls, and her face had the particular tightness of a woman who has spent 30 years converting judgment into a facial expression. Derek sat beside them, swirling a glass of deep red wine and watching the legs of it run down the crystal. When I walked in, not one of the three of them stood up. Gerald and Patricia scanned my clothing. I watched their expressions curdle in real time, from mild curiosity into something close to disgust. Derek did not offer me his hand. He gestured with his wine glass toward the chair, at the very end of the table, the seat furthest from them that the room could physically provide, and then returned his attention to the wine. Emily was not there. Derek said she had gone to the powder room to fix her makeup, and something in the way he said the word makeup told me he had been the reason she needed to. I pulled out my own chair and I sat down in a silence, so heavy it seemed to have weight and temperature. The waiter poured water. That was the signal. Patricia leaned forward, resting fingers loaded with diamonds on the white cloth, and she smiled at me with a warmth so counterfeit it would not have passed at a county fair. She asked how my little house was holding up in the winter. She placed a small, careful emphasis on the word little, the way you might refer to a doghouse or a shed. Then she sighed and complained, at length, about the ruinous expense of heating their estate on Long Island, a burden she described in the tone of a woman recounting a war injury. Gerald joined in more loudly. He told the table about the 3 weeks they had recently spent on the Amalfi Coast, the private terrace, the boat they had hired, the wine they had shipped home in a crate. Then he swirled his glass, looked deliberately down at my scuffed boots, and asked me what exactly it was that I had done for a living before I retired into my quiet, unremarkable little life. I looked back at him and I kept my voice low and steady. I told him I had worked with my hands. I told him I had spent decades in freight, moving boxes, dealing with trucks and drivers and diesel. Every word of it was true. I simply left out the part where I eventually owned 10,000 of those trucks. Gerald laughed. It was a short, ugly sound, and he aimed a glance at his wife that carried the whole of his character in it, a look of shared superiority, an invitation to mock. Between them, in the space of a single laugh, they filed me away as an uneducated warehouse laborer, and having filed me, they stopped considering me a person at all. Derek shifted in his chair. His face had gone red to the ears, and he would not look at me. My existence in that room was a stain on the tablecloth of his new corporate life, and he was ashamed of it, and his shame made him cruel. For the next half hour I was worked over with the patience of a professional. Patricia spoke about restaurants I would never enter and charities whose galas required a 5-figure table. She spoke about a decorator, a sommelier, a man in London who made her husband's shirts. Every anecdote was a small blade slid in at an angle, and none of them were about restaurants or shirts at all. They were about establishing, permanently and beyond dispute, who at that table was a person and who was furniture. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I did not explain. I drank my tap water and I watched them, and I felt something in me that I had not felt in more than 10 years begin very slowly to wake up. Understand me. I am not a violent man and I have never enjoyed cruelty. But I built a company in an industry that eats the gentle for breakfast, and there is a part of me that was forged in those years and never entirely cooled. I had put that part away. I had let it sleep. I had planted hydrangeas and read history books and let the corporate world forget my name. Sitting at the far end of that table, listening to a woman in pearls describe my daughter's father as a social inconvenience, I felt it turn over and open its eyes. The waiter returned and laid the food down. Dry-aged beef, a tower of seafood on crushed ice, butter in a small silver dish. Gerald did not touch any of it. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, and he drew out a thick white envelope, crisp and unbent, and set it squarely on the mahogany. He pressed 2 fingers against the paper and slid it slowly across the polished surface, until it came to rest directly in front of my plate. The room went silent in a way that rooms almost never do. Derek stared at his plate and would not lift his eyes. Patricia took a small sip of wine and watched me over the rim of the glass, with the flat interest of a cat at a window. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked up at Gerald. I asked him what it was. Gerald answered with a bluntness he clearly considered a virtue. He told me the envelope contained a cashier's check for $20,000. He called it a relocation fund. He used that phrase twice as though it had been workshopped in advance. The terms, he said, were absolute and not open to negotiation. I was to invent a reason, failing health, a doctor's advice, a longing for warmer weather in my old age. I was to sell my pathetic little house, move into a low-cost retirement facility somewhere in Florida or Arizona, and remove myself completely and permanently from Emily and Derek's life. I felt my heartbeat slow. It does that in certain moments. Other men's hearts race. Mine goes quiet, and everything around me becomes very clear and very cold, and I can hear the ice settling in a glass 3 feet away. I asked him why on earth I would ever agree to such a thing. Gerald leaned forward, and whatever thin membrane of civility he had been maintaining dissolved entirely. He told me that Derek had just been appointed Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Freight Holdings. He told me his son now moved in circles of serious wealth and serious influence, that there were dinners, boards, introductions, a trajectory. Then he looked at my jacket with open revulsion and told me that my visible poverty, my lack of education, and my low origins were anchors dragging on that trajectory. He said that a man of Derek's standing could not be seen in public with a father-in-law who looked like he had wandered in from a soup kitchen. He said it in a private dining room in front of my daughter's husband. He said it about a man he had known for 40 minutes. I did not touch the envelope. I turned my head slowly and I looked at Derek, the young man I had allowed to marry my only child, the man who had stood in a rented garden 3 years earlier and made promises out loud, in front of witnesses, about honoring and protecting this family. I asked him directly. I asked whether he agreed with his father. I asked whether he truly wanted me to take that money and disappear out of his wife's life. Derek lifted his head. I want you to understand that I gave him a door. I gave him a full, open, unhurried door, and every man watching this deserves to know that the door was there and that he saw it. He looked me in the eye. His face had hardened into something I did not recognize and never wanted to see again. He said that his career required a certain image. He said that the chief executive of a company the size of Meridian Freight Holdings could not have a father-in-law who looked like a janitor. He told me to take the money and do what was best for everyone. What was best for everyone? The betrayal sat in the air of that room like gas leaking from a pipe. He had sold whatever remained of his soul. And he had not even sold it for very much. He had sold it for a seating chart, for the good opinion of people who would forget his name inside a year. And he had absolutely no idea, not the faintest suspicion, that the enormous company he was so proud to run, the corporate empire that had given him this diseased sense of superiority, had been built by the very hands he was insulting. He had no idea that the board of directors who hired him answered, at the very end of a long and deliberately confusing chain of paperwork, to an irrevocable blind trust. He had no idea that the trust was controlled entirely by the old man, sitting at the far end of the table in a frayed tweed jacket, drinking tap water. At that exact moment, the oak door clicked open. Emily walked back into the room. Her face was bright, her hair pushed back behind one ear, and she was completely unaware that an execution had just been scheduled in her absence. She smiled at me across the table and asked whether they had already ordered the appetizers. Before anyone could speak, I reached out, took the white envelope, and slid it smoothly into the inner pocket of my jacket. The atmosphere changed instantly. Gerald and Patricia exchanged a swift, victorious glance. Derek let out a small breath of relief that he probably believed was inaudible. They thought I had surrendered. They thought the poor old man had taken the bribe out of desperation, and I could see all three of them recalibrating in real time, filing this away as the moment they learned that a father's love has a price, and that the price is remarkably low. I looked at my daughter, at Emily, who deserved so much more than the three cowards seated at the other end of that table. I did not scream. I did not overturn the table or make a scene for the benefit of the room. Rage is the tool of a man with no other tools. I was holding every tool in the world. I stood up slowly, keeping every movement deliberate, and reached into my trouser pocket. I found a single crumpled $1 bill. I smoothed it out flat against the linen with 2 fingers, and I placed it precisely in the center of my untouched plate. I looked at Derek and told him that the dollar was to cover the cost of my tap water. I did not want to leave that room owing his family anything at all. Then I turned to my daughter and put a gentle smile on my face, and I have not been prouder of anything in my life than I am of how steady that smile was. I told her I was suddenly not feeling well. I told her the cold had given me a headache and that I needed to go home and lie down. Emily's face fell. She came around the table and put her arms around me and offered to leave the dinner and drive me home herself. I could feel how thin she had gotten through the back of her coat, and that told me more about the previous year of her marriage than any conversation had. I kissed her forehead and told her to stay. I told her to enjoy the evening with her new family. I promised her I would call in the morning. As I pulled away from my daughter, I caught one last look at Gerald Lawson. He had begun cutting into his steak, and he was smirking down at it with the deep satisfaction of a man who believes he has just purchased the world at a discount. I turned my back on all of them and walked out. I moved through the crowded restaurant, past the clinking crystal and the confident laughter of people who had never once in their lives been afraid of a mailbox, and I pushed the brass doors open and stepped out into the freezing dark. The wind hit me full in the face, and I did not feel it. The timid, agreeable old man I had worn for the last 2 hours came off me on that sidewalk like a coat. My spine straightened, my breathing slowed, my eyes narrowed at the black shine of the wet street. I reached into my pocket, past the envelope full of Gerald Lawson's money, and took out my telephone. I scrolled to a number that was not saved under a name. It rang once. Nathaniel Cross, my corporate attorney for 30 years, and the architect of the trust that held my life inside it, answered quietly. I did not greet him. I have never needed to, with Nathaniel. I told him that they had taken the bait. I told him my son-in-law had crossed a line from which no man returns. Then I gave him an order. I told him to open an immediate, thorough, and entirely quiet forensic audit of Derek Lawson's executive accounts at Meridian Freight Holdings. Every authorization, every vendor, every dime that young man had touched since the day the board handed him the corner office. I stood in the shadow beyond the reach of the restaurant lights and watched a valet bring a silver Porsche around to the curb for somebody else's evening. I already knew how this story was going to end. I simply had not yet learned how ugly the middle of it would be. 40 minutes later, the wind was throwing sleet against my windshield as I drove my rusted pickup down the ramp into the underground garage of a glass tower in the financial district. I passed the visitor level entirely and parked in a reserved space that had carried my name on the lease for over 2 decades, in a corner where nobody ever went. The security officer standing beside the private executive elevator did not ask for identification. He nodded, said good evening, and pressed his thumb to the reader on the wall. The steel doors slid apart and carried me up to the 52nd floor. I left the harmless old man down there in the cold with the parking meters. By the time the elevator chimed, my shoulders had squared and my face had gone still. The doors opened onto a wide, dim office with the city burning below it in a grid of orange and white. Nathaniel Cross stood waiting at the end of a long conference table. He had been my lead counsel for 30 solid years. He was a man of absolute loyalty and a quiet, surgical ruthlessness that had ended more corporate careers than any recession. He did not ask about my evening. He did not ask how dinner with my daughter's in-laws had gone. He already knew, because he had answered a telephone call from me at 9 o'clock at night, and in 30 years I had never once called him at 9 o'clock at night about something small. He pushed a stack of leather-bound files across the polished wood. I took off the faded tweed jacket, hung it over the back of a leather chair, and sat down. I laid both hands flat on the table and felt the entire weight of my life resting under my palms. On the top file, stamped in gold, was a name, Meridian Freight Holdings. Derek loved that name. He wore it like a borrowed coat. He said it to waiters, and to strangers at parties, and to his parents on the telephone. And he said it in a way that suggested he had pulled the whole thing up out of the ground himself. He had no earthly idea what it actually costs to build a company. Let me tell you what it costs. 32 years ago, my wife Margaret died. It happened in 11 weeks, from the day of the first scan to the morning of the funeral. And when it was over, I was standing in a kitchen at 4 in the morning with a grieving 3-year-old and a mountain of medical debt so large that I used to lie awake, doing the arithmetic and getting different answers each time. I took what money I had left, which was not enough to be called savings, and I bought a broken-down delivery truck at a county auction. It had a cracked windshield and a transmission that screamed on hills. I rebuilt the transmission myself in a rented garage with a manual open on the floor beside me. Then I worked. I worked 20 hours a day, hauling freight through blizzards that closed the interstate and through August heat that turned the cab into a kiln. I kept my little girl asleep in a nest of blankets in the passenger seat because I could not afford childcare, and I would not leave her with strangers. She learned to count on highway mile markers. Her first complete sentence was about a diesel pump. I skipped meals so she could eat. That is not a figure of speech, and I am not asking for sympathy about it. I am telling you because Gerald Lawson looked at my boots and thought he understood something about my life. Every dollar that came in went back into the business. 1 truck became 3, 3 became 10, 10 became 100, and then a yard, and then a terminal, and then a network. And somewhere in the middle of the 15th year, I looked up from a desk and realized I was running an international logistics operation and had not taken a day off in 4 years. Meridian Freight Holdings is not a corporate entity to me. It is 30 years of my blood, my sweat, and one single obsessive intention: to build a world in which my daughter would never once be afraid of a mailbox. 12 years ago, my cardiologist sat me down and explained, without much decoration, what would happen if I continued at that pace. Margaret had died at 41. Emily had already lost 1 parent. That argument settled the matter faster than any medical chart could have. Our financial future was permanently secure. I decided to step out of the light. I instructed Nathaniel to draft the paperwork, placing my 70% controlling interest in Meridian Freight Holdings into an irrevocable blind trust. I appointed Nathaniel as trustee of record and had my personal name removed entirely from the public corporate registry. And every filing after that pointed at a trust, and the trust pointed at a law firm, and the law firm pointed at nothing at all. To the business world, the founder had simply vanished into an anonymous retirement. There were rumors occasionally in the trade press. Someone in Dallas was certain I had died. Someone in Atlanta was certain I lived on a boat. I lived in a 2-bedroom house with a hydrangea bed and a garage full of tools, 40 minutes from the tower where the board of directors met to manage a company whose owner they had never met. I want to be clear about something because it is the hinge on which this entire disaster turned. The blind trust was not a trick. It was not a trap laid for a future son-in-law who did not yet exist. It was an ordinary, boring, legally conventional instrument used by thousands of retired owners to separate themselves from the daily operation of a business while retaining ultimate control. Mine had one unusual feature: an emergency clause, insisted upon by Nathaniel over my objection, granting the controlling shareholder the unilateral right to freeze executive action and to compel a disclosure meeting of the full board at any time, for any reason, on 24 hours' notice. I remember arguing with him about that clause. I remember calling it paranoid. I remember Nathaniel Cross telling me, in that dry voice of his, that a company is a house and a house should always have a door that opens from the inside. 2 years before the night I am describing, that same board of directors hired a rising young executive named Derek Lawson. They ran his background. They checked his references. They liked his aggression and his quarterly language, and they've promoted him to chief executive officer with a compensation package that would have kept my first 12 drivers in decent houses for the rest of their lives. I did not object because I was not consulted, because that was the entire point of the arrangement, and I never once, in 3 years of family dinners, told my daughter's husband who I was. I sat there in that dim office with my hands on the leather files and looked out at the frozen city, and Nathaniel Cross said the first words he had spoken since I entered the room. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted the truth, all of it, and I wanted it fast, and I wanted no one inside that building to know we were looking. The truth took 31 hours, and it was worse than anything I had prepared myself for. Nathaniel assembled a team of 4 in a windowless conference room on the 51st floor, under a non-disclosure agreement with penalties severe enough to be frightening. The forensic lead was a woman named Diane Foster, a former federal examiner who had spent 9 years dismantling corporate fraud for the government before deciding she would rather be paid properly for it. She was somewhere in her 40s, spoke in short, flat sentences, and treated a general ledger the way a coroner treats a body. I sat in that room with cold coffee and watched her work, and by the second evening, she had stopped calling it an audit and started calling it a scheme. It began the way these things always begin, with vendors. Derek had created 6 of them across 18 months, consulting firms, marketing retainers, a logistics optimization advisory with an address in a suburban office park that turned out to be a mailbox service. Each one had been approved by the chief executive under a spending threshold that did not require secondary authorization, which is a threshold I set myself in 2003 because I trusted my managers and wanted them to be able to move without asking permission for every tire. I built that door. He walked through it. The invoices were forged, but they were forged competently. Round numbers, plausible services, quarterly cadence, and the money flowed out of our treasury into accounts that split it, folded it, and moved it offshore through a Caribbean corporate registry that exists for precisely this purpose and no other. Diane traced it out on the wall monitor as a diagram, and the diagram looked like a nervous system. But the offshore accounts were not the destination. That was the part that made me stand up out of my chair and walk closer to the screen. Derek was not hiding money abroad for some future escape. He was bringing it home. He was cycling it back into the United States through a second layer of consulting fees, fake retainers, and 2 anonymous family trusts, and the primary beneficiaries of those family trusts were Gerald and Patricia Lawson. I stood in that dark room and looked at the illuminated columns and felt the puzzle lock together with a sickening click. The opulent life that Gerald Lawson had rubbed across my face at dinner, the estate on Long Island, the 3 weeks on the Amalfi Coast, the London shirtmaker, was not the fruit of shrewd investment or a lifetime of accomplishment. It was a mirage. It was funded in its entirety by capital stolen out of the treasury of a company I had built by sleeping in truck cabs with a toddler. Diane pulled the itemized expenditures from the family trust and put them up one at a time, and I made myself read every line. There was the invoice for the Amalfi Coast. Hotel, boat charter, a private dinner on a terrace, wine shipped home in a wooden crate. There were the custom suits, the designer luggage, and a diamond necklace that I had watched Patricia Lawson touch at the dinner table when she wanted the light to catch it. There were the transfer logs for 2 imported cars, registered in Gerald's name, paid in full with cash diverted from a freight contract in our Midwest division. That contract funded a terminal in Gary, Indiana, where 60 people worked night shifts. And then Diane opened the largest single file in the audit. 9 days before that dinner, Derek Lawson had wired $4 million out of a Meridian emergency reserve account into a private holding company controlled by his mother. The money was used within 72 hours to purchase a newly commissioned 80-foot motor yacht, currently sitting at a marina in Miami with a registration number and a name painted on the transom. I remember my breathing slowing down again. I thought about the white envelope. I thought about the crisp folded edge of it sliding across the mahogany, and Gerald Lawson's 2 fingers pressed against the paper. $20,000. To pack up my life and vanish out of my daughter's world, because I was, in his phrase, an anchor, and the money in that envelope had been stolen from me. They had looked me in the eye and attempted to purchase my absence with my own life's work. There is a particular flavor of insult in that which I have never found words adequate for, and I have had a long time to look for them. A wave of something hot and violent came up out of my chest, and I had to stand very still until it passed. I thought about the first winter of the company. I thought about sitting on an upturned crate in a freezing rented warehouse with my first 11 drivers, promising them fair wages and a pension fund out of our first real profits, because I knew what it was to lie awake doing arithmetic, and I had decided that no man who drove for me would ever have to do it. I kept that promise. That pension fund is still there. It is one of the 2 or 3 things I have done in my life that I am unambiguously proud of. I have always treated the treasury of that company as something close to sacred, because it is not an abstraction. It is the survival of several thousand honest people, and their families and their mortgages and their children's schooling. Derek Lawson had been using it as a wallet, to buy a boat for 2 people who had never in their lives done a difficult day's work. I closed my eyes and forced the heat back down. Anger makes a man careless, and I could not afford a single careless minute. So I let the rage cool. I let it harden. It went from something molten into something with edges, and I have to tell you honestly that I am not certain the second state is morally superior to the first. It is only more effective. I turned to Nathaniel. I told him we were no longer discussing an executive termination. I told him to trace every physical asset Gerald and Patricia Lawson had acquired in the preceding 18 months. Every vehicle, every piece of jewelry, every deposit, and the yacht. I wanted all of it legally tethered to the embezzlement, so that when the federal government finally moved, the net would close over the entire operation at once, and no one inside it would be able to claim they had simply received a generous gift from a successful son. Because they were not innocent. That was the thing the paper proved beyond argument. Gerald and Patricia had signed documents. They had accepted payments through consulting entities registered in their own names for services they were not qualified to render and had never rendered, in amounts that no honest man mistakes for a present. They knew exactly where the money came from. Nathaniel nodded once, and there was a light in his eye that I had seen perhaps 4 times in 30 years. He began pulling the statutes. I told him one more thing before I left that room, and it was the decision that shaped everything that followed. I told him we would not strike immediately. Derek had a corporate merger gala scheduled for that coming Saturday night, the crowning event of his career, a ballroom full of the city's elite assembled to admire him. I told Nathaniel to let it happen. Let him stand in the light. Let Gerald and Patricia wear the stolen diamonds and drink the imported champagne and accept the admiration of people they had spent a lifetime trying to impress. I wanted them at the absolute summit of their arrogance. I have asked myself since whether that was justice or theater. I have not entirely settled the question. I will come back to it before this story is over, because I think it matters more than the arrests do. Diane handed me a printed summary. I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket, directly against the $20,000 cashier's check that was still there from the restaurant. Those 2 pieces of paper rested against my chest, and between them they contained the entire timeline of a family's destruction. I thanked the team. I told them to encrypt everything and speak to no one. Then I took my faded tweed jacket off the back of the chair and rode the elevator down, and the sun was coming up over the lake in a hard white line as I drove home. The heavy thud of a luxury car door slamming shut echoed down my quiet street on Tuesday afternoon. I was kneeling in the front yard, packing fresh soil around a row of hydrangeas I had put in the previous spring. My hands were black to the wrist. There is a particular clarity that comes from having your hands in the earth, and I had needed it badly that week. I heard the impatient click of expensive leather soles coming up my concrete driveway, and I did not have to look up. Derek Lawson stood over my garden in a tailored silver suit, casting a long shadow across the flower bed, looking at my modest single-story house the way a health inspector looks at a kitchen. He did not greet me. He said we needed to go inside immediately because he did not care to conduct a conversation on a lawn in this neighborhood. I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on an old rag, and led him into the house I bought 30 years ago to raise his wife in. He came into my living room and deliberately did not wipe his shoes on the mat. His eyes went over the faded sofa, the brick fireplace with the crack in the mortar, the framed photographs of Emily on the mantel. Emily at 6 with a missing tooth, Emily at 11 holding a fish, Emily at 18 in a graduation gown squinting into the sun. He looked at 20 years of a father's life, arranged on a shelf, and he made a small sound of contempt through his nose. He dropped a leather briefcase onto my coffee table, snapped the clasps, and pulled out a stack of densely typed legal documents, which he threw down in front of me. He told me to sit and read. I remained standing. I looked at the papers, and then at the man who believed a job title conferred the right to behave like a landlord in another man's home. Derek explained that the $20,000 his father had offered me was only the opening of an arrangement. He had decided to formalize my removal from his life properly, with counsel involved, as he put it. He tapped the pages with a manicured finger to emphasize his own authority. The document was two instruments stitched together. The first was a non-disclosure agreement, binding me never to discuss the financial offer his parents had made at that dinner. The second was a renunciation, in which I would formally disclaim any present or future claim to financial support from my daughter or her marital estate. He wanted me to sign myself into permanent poverty and permanent silence at my kitchen coffee table in an afternoon. I asked him what would happen if I declined. He stepped closer, into that distance men use when they want you to understand that they are physically larger, and dropped his voice into a hard whisper. He told me he would sever my relationship with my daughter entirely. He said he controlled their joint finances, their housing, her calendar, and her future. He promised to make certain I never saw Emily again, nor any grandchildren if I defied him. He spoke about my child as though she were an asset on a schedule, not as a woman he had married, as inventory he had acquired and was entitled to withhold. He was holding my daughter hostage to protect a fraudulent image, and he was doing it in the room where she learned to walk. I looked down at the contract on the coffee table. I read the clauses describing my own irrelevance. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment, because if I dress it up, I am lying to you. A younger version of me, the man who dragged a freight company out of the dirt with raw fury and blistered hands, would have broken that young man's jaw in his own living room and considered it money well spent. I have crushed competitors for a fraction of that disrespect. That impulse did not politely absent itself. It stood right there beside me for several seconds, fully formed, and it was very persuasive. I did not act on it, and I want to tell you plainly why not. Because it is not because I am a better man than that impulse. It is because I have learned that a violent man hands his enemy the story. One punch, and the headline is a father-in-law who assaulted a chief executive in a domestic dispute. One punch, and Derek Lawson becomes the victim, and Emily's inheritance becomes something a defense attorney can argue about, and $4 million sails away on a boat in Miami. Restraint is not gentleness. Restraint is the discipline of a man who has decided he would rather win than feel better. I walked into the kitchen. I washed the soil from my hands and dried them carefully, one finger at a time, and it took as long as it took. Then I came back into the living room, picked up a cheap plastic pen from the counter, leaned over the coffee table, and signed my name at the bottom of his extortion document. I signed it slowly, and I am told my expression while doing so was not a pleasant one. Derek snatched the papers off the table the instant my pen lifted. He shoved them into the briefcase, and his chest came up, like a man stepping off a scale that has finally given him the number he wanted. He had walked into an old man's house and bullied him into submission in under 10 minutes, and he felt, in that moment, entirely untouchable. His arrogance made him blind to what had actually just occurred. He had handed me a signed, dated witness document in which the chief executive officer of Meridian Freight Holdings attempted to extort the controlling shareholder of that same company into silence and into abandoning his family. Understand the mechanics because they matter. That document was worthless as a contract. Any first-year associate could void it. It was obtained by duress, it lacked consideration, and it purported to bargain away things that cannot be bargained. Its value to me was never contractual. Its value was evidentiary. It was a written confession of a threat, in his own drafting, delivered to a man he did not know he was stealing from. When federal investigators later assembled the pattern of conduct required for a racketeering charge, that document was the piece that turned a financial crime into something with intent and character stamped all over it. It was the paper that made it impossible for any attorney to describe Derek Lawson as a talented young executive who had made accounting errors. He put it in my hands himself. He was so proud of it that he asked for a copy to be couriered to his office. Derek zipped the briefcase and walked toward my front door with the posture of unearned victory. Then he stopped, turned around, and delivered his last calculated insult. He announced that he was hosting a corporate merger gala for Meridian Freight Holdings that Saturday. He described it as the summit of his career, an evening of extreme luxury that would cement his legacy as the most powerful chief executive in the city. He explicitly forbade me from coming near the venue. He said my presence would be a grotesque embarrassment in front of his guests, and he warned me that hotel security would put me out onto the street if I attempted to humiliate him in front of the board. I stood in the middle of my quiet living room. I looked at the man who had stolen millions from my company to buy his parents a boat. The man who was, at that very hour, systematically terrorizing my only child. I kept my voice perfectly level, without hostility and without fear. I told him I understood his position completely. I wished him a highly successful evening at his celebration. Derek sneered, muttered something under his breath, and let himself out. I watched through the front window as the car pulled away down my street, and the last of the afternoon light went off the windshield. He believed he had permanently removed me from the board. He had no idea that the board was mine, that the building was mine, that the floor of his corner office was mine, and that the game he thought he had just won was a game whose rules I had written 12 years before he ever heard the company's name. The paperwork was signed, the trap was set, the weekend was 4 days away. The man who was certain he had just buried me had spent the afternoon digging with both hands. The sun had barely gone down on Wednesday when the rain started, coming down hard enough to sound like gravel on the roof. I sat at my kitchen table with the extortion contract in front of me, working through the exact sequence of legal maneuvers Nathaniel would execute, and the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycling. Then a frantic knocking rattled the front door. It was not the confident pounding of my son-in-law. It was fast and uneven and desperate. I went down the hall and pulled the door open. Emily stood on my porch in the freezing downpour, soaked through a coat far too thin for the weather, her hair plastered flat against her cheeks. The self-possessed, stubborn woman I had raised looked like something that had been dropped. She did not say a word. She walked into my chest, and a sob came up out of her that I felt through my ribs. I brought her inside and locked the door. I put a wool blanket around her shoulders, sat her at the kitchen table, and made her tea. And I did not ask her a single question, because I already knew who had done this, and because a person in that condition needs quiet more than they need interrogation. I pulled out a chair across from her and waited. Eventually, she wrapped both hands around the mug and started talking to the surface of the table. She had gone to the grocery store that afternoon. At the register, her card was declined. She tried a second card, then a third. Every account with her name on it had been frozen. She called Derek from the parking lot to ask whether there had been a bank error. He did not express concern. He exploded. He told her she was financially irresponsible, that she was a liability to his corporate image, and that he had frozen the accounts to teach her discipline. He said she could have money when she demonstrated that she understood how to behave. My hands closed into fists under the table where she could not see them. That is not a marital argument. That is a recognized pattern of coercive control, and it has a specific shape. Cut off the money, and independence follows the money out the door. A woman who cannot buy a bus ticket cannot leave. Every advocate who works with these cases will tell you the same thing, and I want any daughter listening to this to hear it plainly. The freezing of the accounts is not a temper tantrum. It is a strategy, and it is usually the second step, not the first. But the money was only the opening of what she had come to tell me. Emily took a shaking breath and said that Derek had come home an hour after that phone call, carrying a folder of documents. He threw them onto the kitchen island and told her to sign. The papers were a total transfer of assets. He wanted her to sign over the private inheritance her mother had left her. I need to explain what that money was. Long before the trust and the holding companies and the offshore filings, before there was any such thing as Meridian Freight Holdings, my wife, Margaret, received a small inheritance from her own parents. It was not a fortune. She could have spent it on a car, or a kitchen, or a holiday somewhere warm, and God knows we could have used all three. She put it in an account for Emily instead, and she asked me to swear I would never touch it, no matter how bad things got. 2 months later she was diagnosed, and 11 weeks after that she was gone. And that account became the last decision my wife ever made on behalf of her daughter. It was not about the amount. It was a mother's hand reaching forward through 30 years to steady a child she knew she would not live to see grown. Derek knew about that money. Emily had told him early in their marriage, in the way you tell someone you love a private thing. He told her he needed the capital to secure a bridge loan on a property they were purchasing on Long Island. He called it a temporary transfer, a formality the bank required. When she hesitated and said she wanted to read the paperwork first, he turned. He called her an ungrateful burden. He accused her of not trusting his judgment. And then he told her that if she had not signed by the following morning, their marriage was over. I sat in my kitchen looking at my heartbroken daughter, and the last piece of Derek Lawson's strategy dropped into place with a sound like a bolt sliding home. There was no property on Long Island. He was running an extraction. Diane Foster's audit had already established that he was bleeding the company to fund his parents' fraudulent life and his own offshore accounts. Now the timeline resolved itself completely. The merger gala that Saturday was not vanity alone. A merger of that size moves an enormous volume of temporary capital through the treasury, and volume is camouflage. He intended to use the noise of the transaction to move the last available millions into his shell structures. Once the funds cleared and settled, he was going to leave. Take the money, take the boat he had bought his parents, and go. He had already looked into which countries do not extradite for financial crimes. Diane found the search history later in a laptop image the government pulled. That detail has never left me, and his greed was so absolute, so entirely without a floor, that he could not bring himself to leave a single dollar behind. He wanted Margaret's money too. He intended to strip my daughter of the last thing her mother ever gave her, drain a 30-year-old account into an offshore entity, and file for divorce from a country where no summons could reach him. He was going to discard her, penniless and publicly humiliated, and he had scheduled it. A cold, quiet calm settled over me at that kitchen table. I looked at the tears on my daughter's face, and every instinct I have as a father told me to tell her everything, right then. To tell her that I owned the building her husband worked in. To tell her that she was the heir to an empire, and that her husband was already a dead man walking, who simply had not received the news. I did not say it. I have thought about that silence more than any other decision in this story, and I am not certain I was right. I have laid awake over it. I want to say that clearly, because I am not offering you a hero who made only correct choices. I told myself two things. The first was true. Emily did not need a corporate titan in that kitchen. She needed her father, the ordinary steady man who had made her feel safe her whole life, and any revelation that large would have knocked her legs out from under her on a night when she had nothing left. The second thing I told myself was tactical and colder. I needed Derek Lawson to feel invincible for 60 more hours. If Emily learned the truth that night, some flicker of it would have shown in her voice on the telephone, and he would have run, and $4 million and any chance of a federal case would have gone with him. So I used my daughter's ignorance as an instrument. That is what I did. Dress it up however you like. That is what it was. And she and I have talked about it since, at length, more than once. And it took a long time before those conversations stopped being difficult. I reached across the table and took her trembling hands in mine, and I looked directly into her eyes. I told her, in a voice that left no room for debate, that she was not going back to that house. Not tonight, not tomorrow. She would sleep in her old bedroom, and she would not answer a single call or message from her husband. I told her to leave the bank accounts alone, and above all, not to sign anything. Emily looked up at me and asked what we were going to do. Her voice shook. She was frightened of the size of him, of the corporate shadow he cast across her life. She genuinely believed he held every card there was to hold. I wiped a tear off her cheek with my thumb. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the flat certainty of a man who has already seen the end of the war. I promised her that by the end of that weekend, Derek Lawson would never be able to hurt her, or anyone else, ever again. I promised her the nightmare was already over. She simply did not know it yet. She leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes, and a long breath went out of her. She did not ask how a retired freight hauler was going to defeat a chief executive officer. She did not ask a single practical question. She just knew her father had made a promise, and in 33 years I had never broken one to her. I cleared the cups, walked her down the hall, and stood in the doorway of her childhood bedroom, until I heard her breathing go slow and even. Then I went back to the kitchen and picked up the telephone. Whatever residue of mercy I might have carried for Derek Lawson or his parents had burned off entirely at that table. I told Nathaniel to move the timeline up. I left my daughter asleep in her childhood bed and drove into the financial district before the sun came up. The city was still wrapped in that hard pre-dawn gray that Chicago does better than anywhere else. Nathaniel was already in his office, shaved, pressed, with a fresh pot of coffee on the glass desk. And I have never once in 30 years arrived anywhere before that man. There was no small talk. He knew the timeline had accelerated because I had told him so at 11 o'clock the night before. I sat down in the chair across from him and told him it was time. I instructed him to execute the emergency clause, the one he had insisted on 12 years earlier over my objection. The door that opens from the inside. Nathaniel drafted the mandate in 90 minutes with a precision that was almost unkind to read. Invoking the controlling shareholders' emergency privilege, the instrument suspended all board-level transactional authority. It froze every executive account. It halted outbound corporate wire transfers above a nominal threshold and placed the Treasury under trustee lock, pending a disclosure meeting. I took a heavy black pen and signed at the bottom of the page. With that signature, Derek Lawson was cut off entirely from the vault. He would not learn it for another 12 hours, and when he did, he would not understand what he was looking at. The reaction inside the executive suite was immediate and, I will admit, deeply satisfying to observe from a distance. By 9 that morning, the board of directors was in a state approaching panic. For over a decade, they had operated under a comfortable arrangement in which the founder was an abstraction, a signature on an annual consent, a ghost who collected dividends and asked for nothing. Now the ghost had reached out of the wall and locked the money. The internal traffic was extraordinary. Vice presidents emailing one another at speed, trying to establish whether they were the target. 2 of them ordered internal reviews of their own divisions within the hour, which tells you a great deal about what men assume when authority suddenly stirs. I did not let them catch their breath. I ordered a second directive issued to the board that same afternoon, and this one was the hinge of the entire plan. As controlling shareholder, I formally compelled a mandatory disclosure meeting of the full board of directors, but I did not schedule it for a Tuesday morning in a conference room with bad carpet and a speakerphone. I scheduled it for Saturday night, 9 o'clock, in the grand ballroom of the hotel where Derek Lawson had spent 4 months planning the gala that was to crown his career. I ordered the legal department to mandate attendance by every member of the executive board, the chief executive officer specifically named. Derek would be legally required to host the meeting that destroyed him. He would provide the room, the lighting, the audiovisual equipment, the microphone, and the audience. Nathaniel drafted the summons with immaculate care, and my identity remained sealed behind the trust. To Derek and to the board, the notice came from the founder and no one else. It stated that the majority shareholder would emerge from anonymity to address the executive team regarding the future of the company. It was a document the board could not refuse, and a command the chief executive could not legally ignore. But the corporate side was only half of what needed doing. Firing a man is a business decision. It takes an afternoon and a letter. What Derek Lawson had done was not a business matter. He had stolen from a pension-bearing company, employing several thousand people, laundered the proceeds through fraudulent entities, enriched 2 knowing accomplices, and was preparing to abandon his wife in a foreign country after emptying her mother's account. That is not a personnel issue. That is a federal case, and taking it anywhere else would have been an insult to every honest employee in that building. I want to be careful and accurate about this next part, because the version people expect is not the version that happened. Nathaniel did not telephone a friend and arrange a raid. There is no such thing. What he did was submit a referral. Diane Foster spent 40 hours converting the audit into a formal package. The vendor registrations with their mailbox addresses, the forged invoices matched line by line against contracts, the routing chains through the offshore registry, the beneficiary documents on the family trusts with Gerald and Patricia Lawson's signatures on them, and the wire confirmation that turned $4 million of reserve capital into a boat in Miami. That package went to the Financial Crimes Division. It was reviewed by a supervisory special agent, and then by a prosecutor from the United States Attorney's Office, because the government does not act on a wealthy man's grievance, and should not. They act on evidence, and they act slowly, and they ask questions that assume you might be lying to them. They asked us a great many questions over the following 2 days. They asked whether I stood to gain financially from the removal of the chief executive. They asked why the controlling shareholder of a company had permitted his own son-in-law to be appointed to run it. That second question was asked twice by 2 different people, and it was a fair question, and my answer sounded weak both times. By Friday evening, they had what they needed for arrest warrants and seizure orders, and I was told in careful language what would and would not happen. There would be no tactical unit storming a ballroom. That is television. Financial crime arrests are quiet by design, because a man in a tuxedo with a wine glass is not a threat to anyone, and because the government has no interest in creating a spectacle that a defense attorney can later characterize as prejudicial. What there would be was a small number of agents in evening clothes, already inside the room as guests, plus a support team staged in the service corridor and the parking structure. When the warrants were executed, it would be done by 2 agents standing close, speaking quietly, with a hand on an elbow. I remember the agent who explained this to me. He was perhaps 50, with the flat delivery of a man who has arrested a great many people who were certain it was a misunderstanding. He told me that the loudest thing in the room would be the crowd. He also told me something else, and it landed harder than he intended. He asked me, near the end of the conversation, whether I understood that once the referral was filed, the matter no longer belonged to me. He said men in my position frequently believe they are directing something, and that they are usually mistaken, and that it goes better for everyone when they accept it early. He was right. From that Friday evening onward, I was not the author of what happened to Derek Lawson. I was a witness who had provided documents. The machinery was the government's, and the government does not take instructions from shareholders, however aggrieved. That is the honest shape of it, and I think the honest shape is more frightening than the cinematic one. There was no army coming. There was only paper and the patient, grinding, indifferent weight of a system that does not care how expensive your watch is. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of Nathaniel's office and looked down at the district, at thousands of people hurrying to work, entirely unaware of the earthquake, moving under the bedrock of Meridian Freight Holdings. 20 floors away and across 2 streets, Derek Lawson was sitting in a corner office, reviewing a seating chart, unaware that his corporate cards had become worthless rectangles of plastic. He believed he was untouchable because he wore a good suit and held a title. He had never learned the thing that every genuinely powerful person eventually learns, which is that real power is almost never loud, and that the quietest man in a room is very often the one holding it. The legal instruments were signed. The federal referral was accepted. The board was terrified. The treasury was locked. Every exit had been closed, one at a time, without a single raised voice. All that remained was to get through Thursday and Friday. I had no idea, driving home that morning, that Gerald and Patricia's law were going to spend Thursday afternoon doing something so remarkably stupid that I would remember it for the rest of my life. The smell of cedar sawdust and motor oil has always brought me a kind of peace that money never has. It was late Thursday afternoon, and I was standing in aisle 4 of Route 9 Hardware and Supply, wearing faded work jeans, scuffed boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. I was loading 50-pound bags of potting soil onto a flatbed cart. My hands were calloused and stained dark. I have always believed a man needs to keep his hands in the dirt to remember where he came from. Building a freight company into a national operation had required me to spend years in tailored suits in glass rooms arguing about margins, and I never once mistook that for the real work. I hauled the 6th bag onto the cart and felt the familiar ache settle across my shoulders, and it was, I remember thinking, the best I had felt all week. That store was a sanctuary. It is a place where a man is judged by whether he knows the difference between a lag bolt and a carriage bolt, which is a fairer test than most. I was at the checkout counter, pulling my worn leather wallet from my back pocket, when a voice came through the front of the store that did not belong in it. I turned my head slowly. Gerald and Patricia Lawson were standing just inside the automatic doors, and they looked absurd. Gerald wore a cream cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders and white loafers that had plainly never encountered actual ground. Patricia was wrapped in a silk trench coat, clutching a handbag that cost more than the cashier in front of me earned in 6 months. They were lost. That was all it was. There is an upscale garden center in the affluent suburb one town over, and they had taken a wrong turn and walked into a real hardware store by mistake. If they had simply turned around, none of the next 10 minutes would have happened. Every consequence that followed for them personally, as distinct from the criminal case, grew out of a wrong turn, and a decision made in the following 4 seconds. Gerald spotted me almost at once. His eyes went over my boots, my flannel shirt, the bags of soil on my cart, and a smile spread across his face that I can only describe as delighted. He nudged his wife and pointed at me with a manicured finger, the way you would point out an animal at a zoo. Then he came over. He crossed the entire front of that store, pulling Patricia along by the sleeve, and he did not lower his voice, because the volume was the point. He wanted the cashier to hear. He wanted the man in aisle 2 to hear. The cashier was Earl Briggs. I had known Earl for 15 years. He had a photograph of 2 grandchildren taped inside the register drawer, and he had cut me a key for my garden shed in 2011. Gerald looked at the bags of dirt and let out a loud theatrical laugh that bounced off the high warehouse ceiling. He said it was fitting. He said it was perfect, actually, to find me dressed like a vagrant hauling fertilizer. He said this was exactly the sort of low-level existence I was destined for, now that his brilliant son was permanently running my company. My company. He used those words. He had no idea what he was saying, and he never did understand it afterward, even when it was explained to him in a courtroom. I stood completely still. I did not clench my hands. I did not raise my voice or offer a word in reply. I looked into Gerald Lawson's eyes, and I thought about an 80-foot motor yacht sitting in a Miami marina, purchased with money taken out of a reserve account that exists to cover payroll in a bad quarter. He was a parasite standing in a hardware store, mocking the host that fed him. Patricia came forward, and her perfume arrived a half-second before she did, a cloud of it that completely overwhelmed the honest smell of sawdust and rope. She looked at me with unvarnished disgust and announced loudly that this was a blessing, truly, because I was finally accepting my proper place in the world. Then she began to brag. She told the front of that store that her son was going to redefine Meridian Freight Holdings that weekend and erase every trace of my outdated influence. She described the gala, the imported champagne, the guest list, the politicians, the brilliant future her family was stepping into. She said her son was about to become the most powerful chief executive in the state. She looked down at my work boots and reminded me that people of my class belonged precisely where I was standing, covered in dirt and forgotten by anyone who mattered. She told me to enjoy playing in the mud while the real builders of this world got on with building a legacy. Gerald chuckled, adjusted the sweater on his shoulders, and added that they would be sure to raise a toast to my miserable retirement while they were out on the new boat. I listened to every word without breaking eye contact once. Here is what I have to tell you about that 10 minutes, and it is the part of this story I am least comfortable with. I could have ended it. One sentence. I could have said the name of the trust. I could have taken out my telephone and shown Gerald Lawson a single document. And I could have watched the blood leave his face right there between the paint mixer and the register. I did not do it, and it was not because I was protecting an investigation. The referral was already filed. Nothing I said in a hardware store on Thursday would have changed the warrants on Friday. I stayed silent because I wanted the fall to be higher. I let them talk. I let them stand there in front of a man they had never met, in a store where I was known and respected, and dig with both hands. And some part of me, a part I am not proud of, was enjoying it. I was 2 days from taking everything they had, and I stood there and let them believe they were humiliating a beaten old man, because their belief made the coming ruin taste better. That is not restraint. Restraint has a purpose. What I did in that hardware store was appetite, and I have had a long time to sit with the difference. I do not think it made me a monster. I think it made me a man who discovered at 69 that there was something in him that liked this, and who had to look at that squarely afterward. Every cruel word out of Patricia's mouth put me back at my kitchen table the night before, looking at my daughter, shivering in a wool blanket with her cards frozen, and her mother's last gift being demanded of her by morning. That memory made the silence easy. It also made it dangerous. I turned back to Earl, who had been standing behind the register through all of it, with an expression of professional and absolute disdain for the two people behind me. I handed him $300 bills for the soil. I told him, in a normal voice, to keep the change and buy those grandchildren something good for the weekend. Earl nodded, thanked me, and completely ignored the two loud strangers at his counter, as though they were a draft coming under the door. He handed me my receipt and wished me a good afternoon. I took hold of the metal handle of the flatbed cart and pushed it directly past Gerald and Patricia Lawson. I did not say a single word to them. I did not give them a parting look. I walked out through the sliding doors into the bright, cold sunlight, and I loaded 400 pounds of soil into the bed of my old truck, and I felt the honest weight of the earth in my hands. The storm was coming on Saturday night, and I was entirely prepared to stand still and let it wash them all away. The clock in my hallway struck midnight on Friday, its brass pendulum keeping the same relentless time it had kept since my wife bought it at an estate sale in 1988. I sat alone at my small kitchen table in the middle of a sleeping neighborhood, with the white glare of a single overhead lamp on stacks of documents. The following night was the gala. The following night, Derek Lawson believed he would be confirmed as an untouchable figure in this city. I turned the pages of the forensic audit slowly, tracing columns of stolen millions with the tip of a pen, and there was a stillness in my chest that I found faintly alarming. The anger that had burned so hot on Wednesday had gone out. What was left in its place was colder, sharper, and considerably more useful. It was the settled certainty of a man who has already measured the exact dimensions of his enemy's grave and found them adequate. My telephone buzzed against the wood. It was Nathaniel. I answered on the first ring and kept my voice down so as not to wake Emily. He did not waste time. He told me the federal position was set. The prosecutor had signed off. The warrants were issued. 3 of them, one for Derek and one each for Gerald and Patricia, along with seizure orders covering the vessel in Miami, the 2 vehicles, and 11 accounts. Agents would be in the ballroom as guests, in evening clothes, from the beginning of the evening. A support team would be staged out of sight. When the disclosure meeting concluded, the warrants would be executed quietly, on the floor, without theatrics. Nathaniel told me one more thing, and he chose his words with the care of a man who has been someone's attorney and friend for 30 years and understands that those are 2 different jobs. He said, "Frank, the government is going to do this whether you are on that stage or not. You do not need to be in the room. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it was the truest thing anyone said to me all week. I did not need to be there. Not one legal outcome, not $1 of recovery, not one day of anyone's sentence depended on my presence in that ballroom. Emily's inheritance was already protected. The theft was already documented. The arrests were already scheduled. Every practical reason to attend had already been satisfied by other people, working in offices on paper. The only thing that required me to walk into that room was that I wanted to be seen. I wanted Derek Lawson to look up and understand. I wanted Patricia Lawson to know who she had been mocking beside a paint mixer. I wanted an audience for the correction of a record. That is a human want. I am not going to pretend it is a noble one. I thanked Nathaniel and told him I would be there at 9. Then I gathered the audit summaries, the transfer logs, and the photographs of the purchases, squared the edges of the stack, and slid it into a heavy dark leather portfolio. I ran my hand over the grain of the leather. That folder was not a collection of corporate data. It was proof of a young man's parasitic theft, and of his parents' eager and documented complicity, and of the exact mechanism by which a stolen treasury had been converted into champagne. I snapped the brass clasp shut, and the click of it was as final as a cell door. There was no room left in me for mercy, and I had stopped looking for any. Mercy is for men who made a mistake. Derek Lawson had not made a mistake. He had made a plan, revised it, funded it, and scheduled its final phase for a Saturday night. I left the portfolio on the kitchen table and walked down the dark hallway to my bedroom. I opened the cedar closet and reached all the way to the back, past coats I no longer wore, and pulled out a garment bag that had not been unzipped in 12 years. Inside was a bespoke midnight blue suit, cut from Italian wool by a tailor in this city who is now dead. I had commissioned that suit for the evening I formally retired, and handed the running of Meridian Freight Holdings to a board of directors. It was the last thing I ever bought as the public founder of anything. I wore it once for 4 hours, shook 80 hands, went home, hung it up, and became a man with a garden. For 12 years, I had been perfectly content in denim and work boots, letting the corporate world forget the name of the man who had built the thing they were all standing on. I had believed my battles were behind me. I had believed that with something like gratitude. Derek and Gerald Lawson had insisted otherwise. They had gone out of their way, over 3 years, to summon the one version of me that everyone in that family should have hoped stayed in the closet. I carried the suit to the ironing board in the corner of the room, plugged in the iron, and waited for the steam to rise. I laid the trousers across the board and began to press them with slow, meticulous attention. There was something almost ceremonial about it. The hiss of the steam, the glide of the plate, the crease coming up sharp under my hands. With every pass I was putting away the invisible old man they had mocked in the hardware store and pressing a hard edge into the uniform of somebody else. I thought about Emily asleep down the hall, in the room where she had done her homework for 12 years, 33 years old, back in a single bed, her heart broken by a man who had regarded her as a line item. I thought about Derek standing in my living room, demanding I sign away my dignity and my daughter's inheritance, while refusing to wipe his shoes. I thought about Gerald laughing at my dirty hands while wearing a sweater bought with my money. Every memory fed the machinery, and I let it, and I knew even then that I was feeding something that would not be easy to shut off afterward. I hung the pressed suit on a wooden valet stand by the window. The dark wool seemed to absorb the light in the room. Beside it I laid a white dress shirt and a silver tie, and I polished a pair of black Oxfords until they threw back the lamp like dark water, erasing every trace of the garden soil that Gerald Lawson had found so funny. Then I went back to the kitchen and switched off the overhead lamp. The leather portfolio sat on the table, a dark shape against the wood. The collision course was set, and it was no longer mine to steer. Physics had it now. Consequence had it. Derek Lawson had built a kingdom on theft and contempt, and on Saturday night the entire weight of his own choices was going to come down through the roof of it. He wanted a spectacle to seal his legacy in front of the elite of this city. I intended to give him exactly the spectacle he had asked for. I intended to give him an audience. I stood in the dark by my front window for a long time, looking out at the empty street where I had taught my daughter to ride a bicycle. I felt no fear and no hesitation. I want to be honest and say that I also felt no peace. The long game of silence was finished. In 21 hours, everyone in that ballroom was going to hear the sound of the falling blade. The grand ballroom of that hotel is a cathedral of glass and gold leaf. A chandelier the size of a small car hangs from a vaulted ceiling, throwing fractured light down over a sea of tuxedos and gowns. That Saturday the air was thick with orchids and imported champagne, and a string quartet on a raised platform in the corner played Schubert with the polished indifference of professionals who have played 400 of these evenings. This was the summit of the city's social apparatus, a curated collection of politicians, bank executives, developers, and industry men assembled to celebrate a corporate merger. To anyone in that room, it was a triumph. To me, it was a crime scene, and every shimmering light and every silver tray of caviar had been paid for out of the arteries of a company built by a man sleeping in a truck cab with a toddler beside him. I arrived at 20 minutes to 9 and did not go in through the main doors. I came up the service stairs to the mezzanine and stood in a shadowed alcove at the balcony rail, out of the light, in a suit I had not worn in 12 years, holding a leather portfolio. Derek Lawson stood in the exact center of the room below me, holding a crystal flute of champagne like a scepter, surrounded by a tight ring of senior board members and investors. He threw his head back and laughed at something teeth bright under the chandelier. His tuxedo fit him perfectly. He looked, I will grant him this much, entirely the part. He was performing the role of the visionary chief executive, and he was performing it well, and he was doing it while his corporate cards had been dead for over 24 hours, and his executive authority had been suspended by a document he had never seen. He was a ghost hosting his own wake, standing on a trapdoor, discussing next quarter. A few yards from him, Gerald and Patricia were putting on a display of their own. They moved through the crowd of dignitaries the way minor royalty inspects a regiment. Gerald had a hand on the shoulder of a city alderman, leaning in to deliver some fabricated account of his own financial genius. On his wrist was a diamond-set watch I could have matched to a wire transfer inside of 30 seconds. Patricia was worse, because Patricia was more ambitious. She wore the diamond necklace, and she wore it deliberately. turning her head under the lights, and she was introducing herself to the wives of our largest shareholders as though she were the matriarch of a 100-year dynasty. They were flaunting stolen property in a room full of people who would have crossed the street to avoid them if they had known, and they were drunk on the attention, and they were entirely insulated by their own arrogance. They did not notice the two men in dinner jackets near the service doors who were not drinking, or the woman at the far end of the bar who had been nursing the same glass of soda water for an hour and a half. I checked the gold pocket watch Margaret gave me on our 20th anniversary, 3 years before she died, 8:52. The time for watching was finished. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because a great deal of what happened next was other people doing their jobs, and I have never liked the version of this story in which I am the only person in the room. At 9 o'clock precisely, the music stopped mid-phrase. Nathaniel Cross walked out onto the small stage where a podium had been set for the merger announcement. He wore a black suit that had cost less than most in that room, and carried himself like a man who did not require the wall behind him. He tapped the microphone once. The sound went through the ballroom like a dropped coin. He introduced himself as trustee of record for the controlling shareholder of Meridian Freight Holdings, and he asked the members of the board of directors to make themselves known and to come forward. The room did not understand yet. There was laughter in the back, a woman asking whether this was part of the entertainment. The board understood. I watched 11 men and women in that crowd go very still, and I watched 2 of them look at each other, and I watched one of them set down a glass on a passing tray. Nathaniel read the notice into the record. He stated that a mandatory disclosure meeting had been compelled under the emergency provision of the trust instrument, that the notice had been properly served on Thursday, that attendance by the chief executive officer was legally required, and that the meeting was, as of that moment, in session. He said that under the corporate charter, the controlling majority shareholder possessed the unilateral right to freeze executive action and to address the board at any time. Then he said the sentence that changed the temperature of that room by 10 degrees. He said that for the first time in 12 years, the founder of Meridian Freight Holdings had chosen to step out of anonymity because he had seen what was growing inside his company, and that the founder was present in this room tonight. Derek Lawson laughed. I heard it from the balcony, a loud theatrical scoff that carried beautifully across a silent ballroom. He adjusted his tie and his chest came up, and I understood exactly what was happening inside his head, because his face was doing all of the work of explaining it. He thought this was a surprise. He thought the reclusive billionaire owner had come out of the shadows to bless the merger and publicly anoint the young chief executive who had made it happen. He believed he was 90 seconds away from the greatest moment of his professional life. He began scanning the crowd, looking among the older men in custom tuxedos for the face he was about to charm. He arranged his most winning smile. I could see him composing the press release. Nathaniel did not scan the room. He raised his right hand and pointed a single steady finger up at the mezzanine balcony. Every head in that ballroom turned. I felt the weight of 600 pairs of eyes arrive on me all at once. And I will tell you that after 12 years of deliberate invisibility, it was not pleasant. It was like stepping out of a dark room into surgical light. I did not hurry. I tightened my grip on the leather portfolio and walked to the head of the sweeping staircase, and I came down it slowly, one step at a time, because I am 69 years old and because there was no reason on earth to rush. The crowd on the floor parted as I reached the bottom, not out of respect. Out of the animal instinct that tells a herd to open a lane when it does not yet know what is walking through. I passed the terrified faces of 2 senior vice presidents, who had recognized in the space of a minute exactly which way the ground was tilting. I passed a man in a dinner jacket standing near the service door, who met my eyes for a fraction of a second and then looked away. I reached the wooden steps to the platform and climbed them, and the sound of my shoes on the boards was the only sound in that entire cathedral of a room. I stepped onto the stage and took my place beside Nathaniel Cross. Then I looked down at the crowd. Derek Lawson was standing in the front, less than 10 feet away. The smile was gone. The color had drained out of his face so completely that he had gone the gray of wet cement. His mouth opened slightly and no sound came out of it. I watched a man's entire understanding of his own life collapse in real time. And I want to be honest with you. I had waited 5 days for that exact moment, and it was not what I expected it to be. There was no soaring feeling. It was more like watching a building come down. You know it has to happen, and you know it is correct, and you still feel the ground move under your feet. He was doing arithmetic, I could see it. The old man in the faded jacket, the tap water, the dollar bill on the plate, the envelope with $20,000 in it, the extortion document he had made me sign in my own living room, and then bragged about to his father. And behind all of it, the $4 million. He looked at the leather portfolio in my hand, and he understood what was in it, and his knees actually moved. A few feet from him, Gerald and Patricia stood frozen. Patricia's hand was at her throat, still clutching the necklace, her knuckles gone bone white. I watched her look from my suit to the stage to the microphone and back, and I watched the realization break over her that 36 hours earlier she had stood in a hardware store and explained to this man that he belonged in the mud. Gerald swayed slightly on his loafers. The predatory smirk he had worn all evening was replaced by something I had last seen on the face of a driver who had just realized his brakes were gone. They had spent years constructing a false dynasty on the back of my quiet labor. They had assumed I was weak because I was polite. They had mistaken a preference for a simple life for an absence of capability, which is a mistake people make constantly and almost always regret. Now the floor of their stolen empire was dissolving under their feet. In public, in front of every person whose good opinion they had spent a decade purchasing. The silence stretched out. I stepped up to the microphone, opened the heavy leather folder, and began. I did not raise my voice. I have sat in enough rooms to know that volume is what men reach for when they do not have facts. I had facts. I had 140 pages of them, cross-referenced, and I did not need to shout at anyone. I leaned into the microphone and welcomed the board of directors, the shareholders, and the guests to a mandatory emergency disclosure meeting. I told them that for 12 years, I had entrusted the daily operation of Meridian Freight Holdings to a new generation of leadership, that I had believed in their competence and their integrity, and that I had been content to stay away. Then I told them that trust without verification is not trust. It is simply hope with a signature on it, and that my recent verification had uncovered something I would now put in front of them, in full, because they were entitled to see it, and because several thousand employees were entitled to have it seen. I raised my hand and gave a short nod to the technicians in the glass booth at the back of the room. Nathaniel had spent 2 hours with them that afternoon, with the hotel's audio-visual manager present, and a written authorization from the trust in hand, because we were about to display privileged financial material, and I was not going to hand anybody a procedural complaint. The screens behind me had been cycling the glowing logo of the merger. All evening they went black. Then they filled with something considerably more illuminating. Offshore bank statements, corporate ledgers, shell company registrations with the same suburban mailbox address repeated 6 times. The harsh white light of those documents fell across the faces of the elite of that city, and I watched 300 people lean forward at once. I walked them through it methodically, the way Diane Foster had walked me through it, because it deserved to be understood rather than merely felt. I showed them the 6 fabricated vendors, and the mailbox service, and the round number invoices submitted on a quarterly cadence for services never rendered. I showed them how the amounts had been kept individually beneath the secondary authorization threshold, which is a detail that told every experienced person in that room that this was not carelessness, but design. I showed them the routing chains through the Caribbean registry, and then, more damningly, the money coming back into the United States through consulting fees and 2 anonymous family trusts. The audience were bankers and investors and lawyers. They did not need it explained twice. They were looking at a textbook embezzlement scheme run from the top of a corporation, and the murmur that began to move through that ballroom had a very particular sound to it. It was the sound of several hundred people quietly recalculating who they had been photographed with. I watched 2 senior vice presidents physically step away from Derek Lawson, opening a space around him on the floor, as though his corruption were airborne. Then I came to the part that was not about corporate governance. I pressed the control on the podium, and the screens changed. The registration documents for an 80-foot motor yacht appeared, and beside them the wire confirmation from a Meridian Freight Holdings reserve account, dated 9 days before that dinner, matching to the dollar. I looked directly at Gerald and Patricia Lawson, standing frozen in the middle of the crowd, and I spoke clearly. I told the room that the brilliant lifestyle of the chief executive's family was not the product of business acumen. It was funded in its entirety by capital stolen from this company, the estate, the vacations, the vehicles, the clothes they were wearing in that room, the champagne in their hands, the necklace around Patricia Lawson's neck, which was purchased on the 14th of the previous May, with money that should have gone into the pension fund of a terminal in Gary, Indiana. Gerald went the color of chalk and stepped backward into the crowd, trying to find a body to stand behind. Patricia made a sound I have not forgotten. It was not a gasp, it was smaller and worse than that, and the crowd around them opened. That is the detail I remember most clearly from the entire evening. Not the screens, not the microphone. The way 100 well-dressed people took one synchronized step away from two of their own, leaving Gerald and Patricia Lawson standing alone in a circle of polished floor in the middle of a ballroom. The guests who had been drinking champagne looked at their glasses. The politicians who had been shaking Gerald's hand 20 minutes earlier now looked at him with an expression of pure clinical distance. I had exposed their manufactured aristocracy to the precise audience they had spent a decade trying to impress. They were not titans of anything. They were two people playing dress-up with money taken out of other people's paychecks. I am obliged to tell you that some part of me was gratified by that circle opening, and that I have thought about that part of myself a good deal since. Derek could not sustain it. His mind gave way under the weight of it in front of everyone. He let out a ragged shout and lunged for the wooden steps of the stage, scrambling up them, his tuxedo pulling awkwardly around a body that had begun to sweat through it. He reached for the microphone with both hands, trying to physically take it from me. He was shouting that the documents were forged, that this was a conspiracy, that the board must not listen to a word of it. He was begging them, actually begging, in the voice of a child caught in a lie so large he cannot see the edges of it. Whatever remained of the executive persona he had spent 5 years constructing came off him on that stage in front of every person in this city whose opinion he had wanted. Nathaniel stepped forward to intercept him. I put my hand up and stopped my attorney. I did not need protection from a broken man, and I did not want anybody touching him. Not there, not in front of me. There would have been something obscene in it. So I stood still and let him claw at the air between us. He was weeping, tears of terror, ruining the whole careful picture of himself. He babbled that he could fix it, that he could return the money, that he simply needed to explain the structures to me privately, that the accounting was complicated and had been misread. He promised to resign quietly if I would only turn off the screens and let him walk out of the room. I looked at him, and here is the thing I have never been able to resolve about that instant. And I am going to say it out loud because leaving it out would make this a cleaner story and a less true one. For half a second, standing over a 34-year-old man on his knees in a ruined tuxedo, weeping in front of 600 people, I felt nothing at all. Not pity, not triumph, not even anger. A complete flat absence, the way a surgeon looks at an incision. And then, immediately behind that, something else moved in me that I did not welcome, which was the awareness that I had wanted this. Not the justice, the kneeling. I am not going to tell you I rose above it. I did not. I leaned into the microphone. I told him his explanations were worthless and his promises were empty, and that his tenure was over. I told Derek Lawson that effective immediately he was removed as Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Freight Holdings, stripped of his title, his authority, and his access, and that he would not enter my building again. The words went out across that ballroom and hung there. Derek collapsed onto his knees on the stage and sobbed into his hands. The corporate part was finished. It had taken 9 minutes. The rest of it did not belong to me at all. Derek Lawson was a heap of tailored wool and ruined pride on the floorboards of that stage, and the echo of his removal was still moving around the room. 600 people stood completely paralyzed, holding their breath, waiting to see what came next. I looked down at the man who had tried to steal my life's work and dismantle my daughter, and he was crying into his hands with his shoulders shaking, and the bravado was gone out of him entirely, and he looked exactly like what he had always been underneath, which was a frightened young man who had wanted to be important very badly. Firing him was an administrative act, a signature and a press release. It corrected a corporate record and nothing else. What came next was not mine. I did not raise my hand and give a signal. I want to correct that impression before it forms, because I have heard this story told back to me twice now with a signal in it, and there was no signal. What actually happened was that a woman in a navy evening gown, who had spent the last 90 minutes at the end of the bar, with a glass of soda water, set the glass down, took a folded document out of a small clutch bag, and began walking toward the stage. A man in a dinner jacket left his position near the service door and walked with her. Neither of them hurried. Nobody in that crowd realized what they were until they were already halfway across the floor. Two more agents came in through the mahogany doors at the back and stood on either side of them, and they did not slam anything. They opened one door and closed it behind themselves. The woman climbed the wooden steps, and she did not look at me at all, which I appreciated more than I can properly explain. She crouched down beside Derek Lawson and spoke to him quietly, close to his ear, for perhaps 15 seconds. I could not hear a word of it, and neither could anyone else in that room. Then she stood, and she and her colleague helped him up onto his feet, one on each arm. She said his name and the words arrest warrant and wire fraud loudly enough for the front 2 rows to hear, because a lawful arrest is not a secret, and then she informed him of his rights in the flat cadence of a woman who has said those sentences several hundred times. They put the handcuffs on him at the back of the stage, out of the sight line of most of the room, with a jacket over his wrists. I want to be very clear about this, because I know what people expect from a store like this one, and I know what would sound better here. There was no tactical unit. There were no vests, no yellow letters, no boots crunching on marble. Nobody was thrown to the ground. There were 6 federal agents in that ballroom, 4 of them in evening clothes, and the entire arrest of Derek Lawson took under 90 seconds and made less noise than the string quartet had. It was quiet and procedural and slightly boring, and it was the most terrifying thing I have ever watched. Because a spectacle you can argue with. A spectacle has a villain in it, and you can build a defense out of one. What happened on that stage was simply the state calmly closing a file it had already finished reading, and there was nothing in it for anyone to hold on to. Derek did not fight. He asked, twice, whether he could call his attorney, and the answer was that he could once they reached the vehicle. He was walked out through a service corridor without going anywhere near the crowd, and I did not see him again for 4 months. Down on the ballroom floor, the reality arrived in Gerald Lawson's mind approximately 8 seconds too late. He saw his son's arms taken. He understood, finally and all at once, that the 2 men who had just come in through the mahogany doors were not there for his son alone. And the instinct that had governed the entire arc of that man's life took over completely. He did not go to his son. He did not look at his wife. Gerald Lawson turned on his white loafers and ran. He shoved a sitting city alderman sideways out of his path, knocking a glass off a table, and sprinted for the side doors near the catering kitchen in a cashmere sweater, with the whole room watching. He made it perhaps 11 steps. The agent who stopped him did not tackle him. He simply stepped into the lane Gerald had chosen, put a hand flat on his chest, and Gerald Lawson folded up against it like a deck chair. 62 years old, no wind, no strength, and no plan beyond the door. They walked him back across the floor of that ballroom in front of every single person he had spent the evening impressing. Patricia never moved at all. She stood exactly where the crowd had left her, alone in that open circle of polished floor, with her hand on a diamond necklace that was now, in the legal sense, evidence. When the agent reached her, she did not resist and she did not speak. She lifted her chin. I have thought about that gesture more than almost anything else from that night. She lifted her chin, in the total ruin of everything she had built her identity on, in handcuffs, in front of the only audience she had ever cared about. The thing she reached for was posture. She was still performing. There was nobody left in that room who was buying it, and she performed anyway, because it was the only language she had ever learned to speak. I did not feel triumphant watching that. I felt something closer to vertigo. A whole human life, spent entirely on the surface of things, and at the bottom of it, nothing but a chin. The 3 of them were gone within 4 minutes. What remained was 600 people in evening clothes, standing in a ballroom with orchids and champagne, and a string quartet that did not know whether to keep playing, and the merger logo back up on the screens because a technician had panicked and hit the wrong control. I stood on that stage in a suit I had not worn in 12 years, and I did not feel like a man who had won anything. Nathaniel came and stood beside me. He did not say a word. He has always known exactly when not to. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, I heard my name. Not the founder, not the majority shareholder. I heard Dad, and I turned around, and every part of the last 5 days that I had been holding together with will and paperwork came apart in my chest at once. Emily was standing at the far end of that ballroom in a coat over ordinary clothes, having been driven there by a man Nathaniel had sent an hour earlier without telling me. Because Nathaniel Cross has known me for 30 years and understood something about this evening that I had not managed to understand myself. She was not supposed to be there. I had specifically arranged for her not to be there. I had spent a week deciding what my daughter did and did not get to know, and it had not once occurred to me to ask her. She came across that floor through a crowd that opened for her, the way it had opened for me, and she was crying, and she looked at me in that suit on that stage, and I watched her understand 12 years of her father's life in about 4 seconds. She did not ask me a single question about the company. She put her arms around me and said, into my shoulder, "Why didn't you tell me?" I did not have an answer for her that night. It took me the better part of 6 months to find one. We did not talk in the ballroom. Nathaniel put us in a car and we went home, and Emily sat in the passenger seat of my old truck with her hands in her lap, and neither of us said anything for the whole drive. The talking started at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning, and it went on, in one form or another, for half a year. I want to spend a moment here, because this is the part of the story that actually mattered. And it is the part that gets left out when people repeat it. The first thing she asked, once we were sitting down, was not about money. She asked me how long. I told her the truth. 32 years. Since the first truck. She had been 3 years old when it started, and she had grown up in a 2-bedroom house with a father who clipped coupons on purpose. And every single year of her life had been quietly underwritten by something she had never been told about. She asked whether her mother had known. I said yes. Margaret knew about the first 11 trucks, and she never lived to see the 12th. And Emily put her face in her hands at that, because it had not occurred to her, before that moment, that her mother had died before the good part. Then she asked the hard one. She asked whether I had known, on Wednesday night in that kitchen, with her soaked through and shaking, that Derek was planning to leave the country. I could have softened it. I had 5 different softer versions available to me, and I could feel each of them arriving in my mouth. I said yes, I knew on Wednesday. I knew when she asked me what we were going to do, and I told her the nightmare was already over. She did not shout at me. It would have been easier if she had. She said, very quietly, that she had spent Thursday and Friday thinking she was going mad, that she had lain in her childhood bed, doing arithmetic about her own marriage, wondering whether she was the problem, whether she had been financially irresponsible after all, whether a reasonable woman would have simply signed the papers. She said she had nearly called him twice on Friday to apologize, and her father, sleeping 40 feet down the hall, had known the whole time and had decided she was better off not knowing. She said, "You let me feel crazy for 2 days so your plan would work." That is exactly what I did. I have turned that sentence over for a long time. Every practical justification I offered you earlier is real. If she had known, her voice would have changed on the telephone, and he would have moved the money, and there would have been no case. I still believe that. Diane Foster believes it. The prosecutor said as much. And it is also true that I made a decision about a 33-year-old woman's own life without consulting her, on the grounds that I understood her situation better than she did. Which is, if you look at it without flinching, the identical logic Derek Lawson used when he froze her bank accounts. Not the same act. Not remotely the same intent. And I will not accept a false equivalence between protecting my daughter and looting her. But the same underlying assumption. That she was an object to be managed toward a good outcome rather than a person to be told the truth and trusted with it. That assumption did not begin that week. That is the thing I had to face. It began 3 years earlier when I sat in my living room and watched a young man appraise my furniture and decided not to say anything to my daughter about what I had seen, because I had judged that she could not handle her father's opinion. I had been managing Emily her entire adult life. I had simply been doing it gently enough that neither of us noticed. We came back to that conversation perhaps a dozen times over the following months. Some of those conversations were bad. There was a night in April when she left, and drove home to her apartment at 11 o'clock, and did not answer the telephone for 2 days. And I sat in that house and understood that I had not actually won anything in that ballroom at all. What repaired it was not an apology, although I made several and meant all of them. What repaired it was that I stopped. I gave her the complete accounting, every entity, every holding, the full structure, laid out on that kitchen table, over 3 afternoons with Nathaniel present to answer questions. I did not curate it. I did not decide what she needed to know. And when it came time to restructure the trust that protects her, I did not draft it and present it to her for signature. She sat in the room. She asked questions I could not answer, and Nathaniel could. She rejected the first proposal outright, and she was right to, and the second version was largely hers. She is a trustee now, not a beneficiary. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole point. I also had to tell her about the hardware store. That one was harder than the rest of it, in a way I had not anticipated, because there was no tactical justification available. I could not tell her. I had stayed silent in front of Gerald and Patricia Lawson to protect an investigation. I had stayed silent because I wanted them higher up before they fell. She listened to that whole account, and then she asked me one question, which was whether I had enjoyed the gala. And I told her the truth, which was that I had enjoyed part of it, and that the part I had enjoyed frightened me more than anything Derek had done. She sat with that for a while. Then she said something I have carried since. She said that she had spent 3 years married to a man who had turned every conversation into a position to be won, and that the reason she believed me now was that I had just told her something that made me look worse. I did not go looking for absolution from my daughter, and I did not get any. What I got was better than absolution. There is one other thing from those months that belongs here. In March, Emily asked me to drive her to a storage facility on the west side of the city, where the contents of the house she had shared with Derek had been packed into 14 boxes by a service because she could not face doing it herself. We sat on the concrete floor of that unit for 3 hours going through them, and near the bottom of the 11th box she found her wedding album. She did not cry. She looked at it for a long time, at the photographs of a rented garden and a young man in a good suit, and a woman who genuinely believed she was being loved, and then she closed it and put it back in the box and taped the box shut. She said, "I wasn't stupid. I want you to say that I wasn't stupid." I told her she was not stupid. I told her she had been targeted by a person who was extremely good at what he did, that being deceived by a skilled liar is not a character flaw, and that in 3 years he had also successfully deceived a board of directors, 2 auditors, an executive search firm, and me, especially me. I had watched that young man across a dinner table for 3 years with all of my instincts intact and all of my resources available, and I had concluded that he was a social climber, unpleasant but harmless, not worth a confrontation. I had been wrong by roughly $4 million. If a man with 30 years of boardroom experience and a forensic accounting team on retainer can be that wrong, then a woman who fell in love in her 20s can be forgiven for missing it. She leaned against my shoulder on the floor of that storage unit, and we sat there among the boxes for a while longer, and that was the afternoon I would call the turn, if anyone asked me to name one. Not the ballroom, a concrete floor and a taped-up box and a daughter who needed to hear one true sentence from her father. 6 months dissolved what was left of the Lawson family's version of itself. The federal justice system does not move dramatically. It moves the way a glacier moves, and it leaves the same kind of landscape behind. There was no lengthy trial. Derek Lawson's defense attorneys, who were expensive and competent, looked at Diane Foster's evidence package and gave him the only advice available to them, which was to negotiate. He pleaded to wire fraud, money laundering, and 1 count under the racketeering statute. At sentencing, the judge spoke for 11 minutes before pronouncing anything, and I was in the courtroom for all of it. She talked less about the money than I expected. What she kept returning to was the pension fund. She noted that the reserve account he had drained existed to make payroll in a bad quarter, and she asked, rhetorically, what he imagined would have happened to the night crew at the Gary terminal if there had been a bad quarter. He was sentenced to 9 years in a federal facility, with restitution ordered in an amount he will never in his life be able to pay. Gerald and Patricia pleaded separately to conspiracy and to receipt of criminally derived property. The government had their signatures on the trust documents and their names on the consulting entities, and there was no version of the facts in which they had not known. Gerald received 41 months. Patricia received 28. The assets went the way assets go. Federal marshals seized the yacht in Miami and it was sold at auction, and I am told it went for considerably less than $4 million, which is how these things always work. The two imported cars were towed out of a driveway on a Tuesday morning. 11 accounts were frozen and then drained by the government. The estate on Long Island turned out to be mortgaged to within an inch of its value, and the bank took it before the marshals could. The recovery came back to the trust, and I put every dollar of it into the pension fund it had been taken from, which was not generosity. It was accounting. Now I am going to tell you the part that people do not want to hear, and I am going to tell you anyway, because the version of this story that ends with satisfaction is a lie, and I have decided not to tell you lies. I went to see Derek Lawson in the 4th month. Nobody knows why I did it. Nathaniel advised against it. Emily did not know until afterward. I sat across a table from a 34-year-old man in a facility outside Terre Haute, and he had lost about 20 pounds, and he did not look like a chief executive, and he did not look like a monster. He looked like somebody's son. I had gone there, I think, expecting a reckoning. I had a speech somewhere in me about what he had done to my daughter. I never gave it. He talked for most of the 40 minutes, and what he talked about was his father. He told me that Gerald Lawson had been a commercial real estate broker, whose business collapsed in 2009, and who never worked seriously again, and that from the time Derek was 19, the family's entire public performance of wealth had been financed by whatever Derek could bring home. He said the estate on Long Island had been remortgaged 3 times. He said his mother had told him, at his college graduation, that the family was counting on him. He said the first fraudulent invoice was for $80,000, and it was to cover a payment his parents had missed, and he had genuinely intended to pay it back within the quarter. I want to be careful here. He was not confessing. He was constructing, in real time, a version in which he was a victim, and I could see him doing it, and some of what he told me was almost certainly untrue. But not all of it was, because I checked. I had Diane Foster look afterward, and Gerald Lawson's business did collapse in 2009, and the property was remortgaged 3 times, and the arithmetic of that family's life had not added up for 15 years before Derek Lawson ever heard the name of my company. The man who slid a white envelope across a mahogany table and offered to buy me out of my daughter's life was at that moment functionally insolvent and living on his son's crimes. Every word he said to me that night about my poverty was said by a man who had nothing. Contempt of that particular volume is almost never about the person receiving it. I do not offer this as an excuse for anything. He was 34 years old. He was not a child. He had a salary of $900,000 a year, and he could have said no at any point across 18 months, and instead he escalated, and at the end of it he was going to strip a 30-year-old account from his own wife and leave the country. Nothing in his father's failures obligated him to that. Thousands of people carry demanding families without stealing pension money. But I had spent 5 days constructing him in my mind as a pure specimen of greed, because that made what I was doing to him clean. He was not a pure specimen of anything. He was a weak man raised by 2 people who taught him that appearance was the only real currency, who never gave him a single tool for handling failure, and who then presented him with a bill and let him work out how to pay it. And I sat across that table and understood that I had a part in the same machinery, because for 3 years I had watched my son-in-law perform wealth he did not have, and I had known, better than anyone alive, exactly how hollow that performance was, and I had said nothing. I had enjoyed knowing. I had sat in that faded jacket at 3 years of family dinners with a secret in my pocket, letting a desperate young man dig, because there was something satisfying in being the only person at the table who knew the truth. I am not claiming I could have saved him. He may have been unsalvageable by the time I met him. I am saying that I never once tried, and that I never once tried because the not trying was more comfortable for me. I left that facility and sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive. Gerald and Patricia served their time in separate facilities and were released, and they now live in a small apartment on the far edge of the city, and I know that, because the restitution order requires them to report their address to the court. I am not going to entertain you with an account of their poverty. I could. The original version of this story that lived in my head for months was full of it. The peeling linoleum, the coupons, the public bus, the arguments through thin walls. I used to lie awake, constructing those details with something close to pleasure. And I want any person listening who has been humiliated by somebody to know that I understand that impulse from the inside. But I have come to think that the appetite for that is a wound and not a virtue, and I am not going to feed yours. Here is what I will tell you. They are elderly, they are poor, they are estranged from their only son, and nobody they used to know returns their calls. Whatever education is available in that, they have received it, son, and nobody they used to know returns their calls. Whatever education is available in that, they have received it, and it is not my business to grade the examination. There is no secret account waiting to rescue them. That is true. It is also not a happy ending. It is just an ending. Emily filed for divorce in February, and it was finalized in June. Her mother's inheritance was never touched. It sits exactly where Margaret put it 31 years ago, in an account with one name on it, and my daughter has told me she intends to leave it there and pass it on untouched, for the same reason it was created. Some things are not for spending. This morning the air was crisp and completely still. I sat on the worn wooden steps of my front porch, holding a chipped ceramic mug in both hands. The wood under me is old and weathered and marked by decades of seasons, and by the countless times my boots have scraped across it. I took a slow sip of coffee, cheap coffee, store-bought, brewed too strong, exactly the way I have taken it for 40 years. I have tried the expensive kind. I could not tell the difference, and I resented being unable to. I watched the first pale light come up over the rooftops and paint the street in blue and gray. Across the way, Mrs. Dolores Kane was walking her golden retriever in a wool coat, and she waved, and I waved back. The newspaper truck came around the corner, tires rolling over damp asphalt. An ordinary morning in an ordinary neighborhood. Nobody looking at an old man on a peeling porch in a faded flannel shirt would suspect anything at all about him, and that remains exactly how I want it. The screen door squeaked behind me. Emily came out with her own mug in an oversized sweater and sat down beside me on the step without a word, pulling her knees up. She does not live here anymore. She has an apartment on the north side and a job she chose herself, and she comes on Saturdays. I looked at my daughter. The dark half-circles that lived under her eyes for most of last year are gone. The tension that used to sit permanently across her shoulders has let go. She looks rested. She looks like herself, which is a specific thing and not the same as looking happy. She is not entirely healed. I want to say that, because I have noticed that stories like this one tend to end with people fully repaired, and real people are not fully repaired at the 6-month mark. She still checks her bank balance more often than she needs to. She still goes quiet sometimes in the middle of a conversation, for reasons she does not always explain, and I have learned not to ask. She sees a therapist on Thursdays. She told me about it defensively, as though I might disapprove, and I told her it was the single most sensible thing anyone in this family had done in 2 years. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the cool morning air and watched the street come awake, and we did not fill the silence with anything. The quiet between us is no longer heavy with what is not being said. That took work. It took a dozen difficult conversations and one bad night in April, and a long afternoon on the floor of a storage unit, and it is not finished, and it is real. She asked me once, not long after the sentencing, why I did not want to move. She had seen the statements by then. She knew I could buy any house in any zip code in this country, a fleet of cars, an aircraft, an island if I wanted one. I told her what I have told myself for 30 years. A house is a structure made of wood and glass. A home is a repository of memory, and the two are not related. I built the addition on the back of this house with my own hands in 1994. I carried her mother across this threshold. I marked Emily's height on the kitchen doorframe every summer until she left for college, and the marks are still there, and the last one is in a different color because I ran out of the first pencil. There is no amount of capital in the world that purchases that. Moving into some sterile, enormous place with a gate on it would not elevate my life. It would erase the only part of it that was ever worth anything. At Meridian Freight Holdings, the atmosphere has changed completely. The culture Derek Lawson cultivated in 2 years, in which aggression was a strategy and the quarterly number was a moral value, has been dismantled. Nathaniel and I selected a new executive board slowly and carefully, and I interviewed every one of them personally, which I had not done in 12 years, and which I should never have stopped doing. That is the governance lesson, and I am going to state it plainly, because there are people watching this who own or run something. Derek Lawson did not defeat my company's controls. He walked through a door I built and then left unattended for 12 years. I set a secondary authorization threshold in 2003 and never once revisited it as the company grew, so that by 2024 the amount a chief executive could move, without a second signature, had become, in real terms, absurd. I had no independent audit committee. I had no reporting line that bypassed the chief executive. I had removed myself so completely, in the name of a quiet retirement, that a single individual at the top of that structure was answerable to nobody who was actually paying attention. I have heard people call what happened to me a betrayal. It was. It was also a foreseeable consequence of an owner who wanted a garden more than he wanted responsibility. And I am the owner in that sentence. Every one of those gaps is closed now. There is a real audit committee with a direct line to the trust. Thresholds are reviewed annually. Any employee at any level can report a financial irregularity through a channel that no executive can see, and 2 people have used it, and both reports were nothing, and I was glad both times. The company is profitable again. The profits are going into wages and equipment and the pension fund rather than into an offshore registry. I do not sit in the corner office. I never will again. But I read the quarterly reports now, cover to cover, and I ask questions. And once a year I walk the floor of the terminal in Gary, Indiana, and shake hands with people whose paychecks were 9 days from being someone's boat. The billions in those protected accounts are not a secret I have to guard anymore. Emily knows the full structure. She is a trustee. She has voted against me twice. The money is not a shield and it is not a weapon. It is a tool, and it belongs in a drawer with the other tools. The sun came up over the rooftops while we sat there. Gold and orange spilled across the lawns and lit the dew on the grass, and a breeze moved through the old oak in the front yard that was here before I was. I took another sip of bad coffee and felt something settle in my chest. The war is over. It ended less like a victory than like weather clearing. I looked down at my daughter, sitting on a step she has been sitting on since she was 4 years old, and I understood something that took me 69 years and 1 very bad week to arrive at. The victory was never the destruction of my enemies. It was not the recovery of the money, and it certainly was not that ballroom. It was this, a quiet morning, a cheap mug, being trusted again by the one person whose trust I nearly spent. I did not need a bespoke suit or a room full of frightened executives to know what I am worth. I needed to be told the truth by my own child, and to have told her the truth first. I closed my eyes and let the sun come onto my face, and I thought about how close I came, in that ballroom, to becoming a man who needed an audience. I have had a long time to think about what this whole thing was actually about, and I want to spend the last few minutes of your afternoon on that rather than on the arrests, because the arrests are the least useful part. The first thing is the one people take from stories like this, and it is true, but it is shallow, so I will put it down and move past it quickly. Yes. Never measure a person by their sleeves. Every one of us has stood behind a man in a checkout line and made a complete assessment of his life from his coat. I have been on both ends of that. Gerald Lawson looked at my boots and constructed an entire biography, and every single detail of it was wrong, and the error cost him everything he had. That is the easy lesson, and the internet is full of it. Here is the harder one. The people who humiliate strangers are, almost without exception, in trouble themselves. I did not understand that until I sat across a table from Derek Lawson in a federal facility and learned that the man who had offered to buy me out of my daughter's life was, on the night he did it, functionally broke and living on stolen money. Every word Gerald Lawson said to me about my poverty was said by a bankrupt. Every word Patricia said in that hardware store about my proper place in the world was said by a woman 2 days from having her jewelry seized. Contempt at that volume is not confidence. Confidence is quiet. That noise was the sound of 2 people trying to stay ahead of something. This does not make them innocent, and it does not obligate you to forgive anyone. But if you are the person on the receiving end of it, I want you to have this, because it is worth more than a comeback. When somebody is loudly diminishing you in public, you are almost never looking at a strong person. You are looking at somebody managing a private terror, and the diminishing is the management. The second thing is for the fathers, and I am the cautionary tale in it. I watched Derek Lawson appraise my furniture on the first evening he entered my house. I saw exactly what he was, and I said nothing to my daughter for 3 years, because I told myself that a father who interferes loses a daughter, and because saying nothing was easier and quieter, and let me keep my secret and my dignity intact. That silence was not respect for her autonomy. I have had to be honest with myself about this. Respect for her autonomy would have been telling her plainly what I had seen, once, without pressure, and then trusting her to weigh it. What I actually did was withhold information, because I had decided she could not handle it, which is not respect. It is management. And when the crisis came, I did the same thing at a larger scale. I sat in my kitchen with my daughter shivering in a blanket, knowing that her husband intended to strip her and leave the country, and I decided she was better off not knowing for another 60 hours because my plan required it. I told you earlier that this is the same logic Derek used when he froze her accounts, in a different key. I stand by that. My intent was protection and his was theft, and those are not morally equivalent, and I will not have them called equivalent. But the underlying assumption was identical, that this woman was a situation to be handled rather than an adult to be told the truth. Protection and control both begin with the words "for your own good." The difference between them is whether the other person gets to have a vote. If you are a parent watching this and you have information about your adult child's marriage, tell them once, kindly. Then let them choose, and stay close either way, because the alternative is that you become someone who manages them, and one day they will notice, and they will be right. The third thing is for anyone who is currently in a marriage where the money has become a weapon. Look again at what actually happened to my daughter, because the shape of it is standard, and the standard shape is the whole warning. He did not begin with the accounts. He began years earlier, with small corrections about how she spent, delivered as concern. Then criticism of her judgment. Then criticism of her family, which is always the load-bearing move, because a person cut off from the people who knew her before is a person with nobody left to check her against. Then a demand for paperwork under time pressure, framed as a formality, with a deadline attached. Then the accounts. Financial control is not a symptom of a bad marriage. It is a recognized pattern of abuse with a documented sequence, and the freezing of the money is usually one of the last steps, not one of the first. Somebody who cannot buy a bus ticket cannot leave. If any part of that sequence sounds like your Tuesday, please talk to somebody outside your household about it. Not the internet. A person, a lawyer, a doctor, a domestic violence advocate, a sibling, a friend you have lost touch with because he made it awkward to see her. There are organizations in every state that do nothing but this, and they will explain your options without telling you what to do. And to any woman in that situation who is quietly wondering whether she is the problem. My daughter wondered that, too, in a childhood bedroom at 33, with a mountain of evidence available 40 feet down the hall. Being deceived by somebody skilled at deceiving is not a character defect, it is what the skill is for. The fourth thing is about elders, and it cuts in 2 directions. Older people are targeted constantly, and the first move is almost always geographic. Move to a warmer climate, move to a facility. Move somewhere pleasant, far from the people who would notice. Gerald Lawson tried it on me with a $20,000 check and a story about my failing health. Every year in this country, the same offer is made to thousands of old men and women who do not have a forensic accounting team, and they take it because they are lonely, and they have been told they are a burden. If an offer to relocate you is combined with a request to sign something and a deadline, that is not concern. Talk to a lawyer who is yours and not theirs. But here is the other direction, and it is the one I have to say about myself. I was 69 years old and I had a great deal of power, and I used it that week extremely well and not entirely cleanly. I stood in a hardware store and let 2 people insult me in front of a man I have known for 15 years, not to protect an investigation, but because I wanted their fall to be higher. I stood on a stage in front of 600 people and watched a man collapse onto his knees, and I felt something that was not justice. Nathaniel Cross told me, at midnight the night before, that the government was going to do this whether I was in that room or not. He was right. Not $1, and not one day of anyone's sentence required my presence. The only thing that required me to be on that stage was that I wanted to be seen. I went anyway, I am not going to tell you I regret it, because I would probably do it again. And I have decided not to lie to you in the last 5 minutes of this. What I will tell you is what it cost. It cost me the ability to think of myself as a purely decent man, and I had grown quite attached to that. I discovered at 69 that there was an appetite in me for another person's humiliation, and once you have seen that in yourself, you do not get to unsee it. The story I would like to tell you is that quiet restraint defeated loud arrogance. Some of that is true. I never raised my voice, I never threw a punch, and every consequence that reached that family came through documents and courts, rather than through anything I did with my hands. That restraint was real, and it was the only reason it worked. But restraint that is only tactical is not a virtue. It is a technique. For most of that week, mine was a technique. Real restraint would have been going home on Friday night and letting the government do its work in a courtroom without me. So here is the last thing, and it is the only one I would insist on. Wealth used as a weapon of arrogance destroys the person wielding it. That is not a moral platitude, it is a mechanism, and I watched it operate on both sides of that ballroom. It destroyed Gerald and Patricia Lawson, who had none and pretended, and it very nearly did something to me, who had a great deal and had spent 12 years being quite pleased with myself for hiding it. Because the secret was not humility. Not entirely. Some of it was. And some of it was the private pleasure of being the only man at the table who knew. And there is a version of me, in a slightly different week, who would have found that pleasure much more expensive than it turned out to be. Do not confuse a polished exterior with a decent heart. Do not mistake kindness for weakness. And do not mistake the fact that you were wronged for a guarantee that you will behave well once you have the power to answer it. That part is not automatic. That part you have to choose on the night, when nobody is watching, and there is no audience and no leverage and no one to be impressed. The strongest foundation a family can be built on is not money. It is not even loyalty. It is the ordinary, unglamorous willingness to tell each other the truth before it becomes an emergency. My daughter and I did not have that. We have it now, and it cost us both a great deal more than it should have. If this story reached you somewhere real, I would ask 3 small things of you before you go. Leave a like, because it genuinely does help these stories find the people who need them. Subscribe to my channel, because I tell one of these every week, and I would like you here for the next one. And in the comments below, tell me honestly which part you disagreed with, because I have a suspicion that some of you think I was too hard, and some of you think I was far too soft, and I would rather hear that than agreement. And if you know somebody whose bank card stopped working recently, and who has gone a little quiet lately, and who has stopped bringing up her husband in conversation, send this to her. Do not add a message, just send it. Thank you for giving me your time. It is the only thing any of us